Williams, did I say that right?
Ashleen, yep.
Ashleen. Tom Powell. Ashleen is a researcher at the University of Michigan. I'll let her introduce herself, and Tom Powell is a professor in the School of Social Work. So take it away.
All right, so I'm Ashleen Williams. I am a clinical lecturer, and if you were at the previous session, you also heard that I am the inaugural NAMI Unger Fellow. So my job as the fellow is to be a research ambassador. So I am here to tell you a little bit about what I do, but more importantly, to hear what your thoughts and concerns are. If there are areas about research that you want to know more about, or that you think researchers aren't paying attention to, but we should be. I think that a lot of the advances that occur in medicine in general, but particularly in mental health, come from everyday people who make observations that the rest of us may not get the opportunity to see. And that information is very helpful in deciding how to embark on research programs, how to design research so that it actually is translatable to everyday life. So I hope that you guys will feel free to ask questions and make suggestions.
Here. Let's put the thingy on. There you go.
I'm Tom Powell, and I'll simply follow Ashlyn's presentation with some ideas from you about what you take away today and what next steps there might be. And let me just say I'm delighted that NAMI has embarked on this to be sponsoring a research psychiatrist. This is a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous commitment on the part of NAMI to contribute to our research knowledge, and very glad that you're here.
Thank you.
Let me say something too, if you don't mind. NAMI Michigan is the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health outreach partner for NIMH. So we have been tasked by NIMH through a grant process to try to develop ways of translating research into ways and important knowledge that people like you and me can use. So I'm really pleased that we're doing this, and I'm looking forward to it as well.
Okay, so I just wanted to explain to you a little bit about what I am currently doing. This is not something that is meant to overwhelm you with information. I just thought it would be of some interest to you to know kind of what I spend most of my days thinking about. But as was mentioned, I am a psychiatrist as well. So I'm a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist. So if you have questions that pertain to things that are different from what I'm talking about, feel free to ask. I am primarily a researcher, so I study cell and developmental biology. I also work in the Department of Molecular and Integrative Physiology, as well as being in psychiatry. So there's no topic that's off the table. I may not know the answer, but I'm happy to think about it with you. So primarily what I do is I work in a cell and developmental biology laboratory, which is Sue O'Shea's lab. And she was the person who first established the embryonic stem cell core at the University of Michigan. She has been working with Melvin McGinnis in the Department of Psychiatry and the Proctor longitudinal study of bipolar disorder to use induced pluripotent stem cells to study bipolar disorder. So many of you know this, but there is often a lag between the first time somebody has any symptoms and the first time that they have what is considered to be the full phenotype, or a set of symptoms that is severe enough and has been present for long enough that a diagnosis can be made. But all of you know that it wasn't just one day somebody woke up and they had bipolar disorder. There were things that were happening along the way that were hints at what was to come. We actually believe that what might be happening is that there are differences in the way the brain develops over time, and this contributes to the symptoms and eventually the full phenotype. So what happens at birth is just a continuation of what was happening in the womb, and there are a lot of signs that prenatal development, there are some differences in terms of gene expression, in terms of cell types that form. So what we're really trying to do is to develop a developmental model of the disease so that we can study it, because people who have bipolar disorder, they are struggling with things that have been a long time in development. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the root cause. We're trying to understand the developmental processes that lead to bipolar disorder. So we are struggling with the fact that some of you may know that we've been hunting for the gene for bipolar disorder, and it turns out there is not one, there are many. This is very different from something like Huntington's disease, where there is one gene. And if you have that one gene, you will get Huntington's disease. That is not true for bipolar disorder or most other psychiatric conditions. So that means that we can't make mouse models of it. We also can't ask mice if they're depressed. We can't ask them if they're manic. But those are the model systems that science has used for cancer, that we've used for diabetes. And they work very well. They tend not to work quite as well in psychiatric conditions. So what we do is we use patient cells to build up a developmental model. So I work in the Proctor longitudinal study. We follow people over time. Currently, we're in year 10, which is quite a long study by most standards. Most of the literature you read is they'll do a drug trial for 4 weeks or 8 weeks. And so these are people who have contributed to our understanding of bipolar disorder for the past 10 years. And the participants in the study are really the reason that we can do any of the work that we do. They are really phenomenal people. We get skin samples from people who want to contribute to this study. And so we just take punch biopsies of skin, which is the same type of punch biopsy you would get at a dermatologist's office. And we make stem cell lines from those skin samples. So essentially we get embryonic stem cells, but we're not getting them from embryos. We're getting them from adults who have consented to give a small piece of skin. And this is the overall method, is that we get a differentiated somatic cell. So in our case, it's skin. It can be done with blood cells. It can be done with many different types of cells. We induce those cells to express pluripotency genes, and that causes them to become induced pluripotent stem cells. And then we differentiate them into the cell types that we want to study. And in our case, that's neurons and glia. So, I made a mistake. So, well, I guess the video is not going to play, but if you guys are interested afterward, you can come up and take a look. We have videos of neurons developing in culture, so you can watch how the neurons actually grow. And this is quite similar to what was happening when that person was growing in the womb. They're expressing similar types of genes because we haven't changed any of the genetic material. So we use these to study what genes are changing, what's different between people who have bipolar disorder and controls. These are also videos that I suspect aren't going to play, but we use calcium indicators to show us when cells are active. And we do have some hints that calcium channels are important in bipolar disorder. So I mentioned that there's not one gene, but there is one gene that seems to come up over and over and over again in genome-wide association studies, and that is the voltage-gated L-type voltage-gated calcium channel. But basically what that means is that when cells are active, calcium gets released into the cell. And there are genetic differences between those calcium channels for people who are at risk of bipolar disorder, as well as schizophrenia, depression, autism, and healthy controls. So lithium, which is a commonly used anti-manic agent, is also thought to work by some of these calcium-dependent processes. So my work really focuses on trying to understand how calcium channel dysfunction might be contributing to the risk of bipolar disorder and other diseases. And I won't go into, this is very data heavy, but essentially there are a couple of calcium channel genes that have been identified as risk factors, and they are risk factors for other mental health conditions as well. So one of the things that we might talk about, I know that Dr. Creekmore was thinking about talking a little bit about the difference between the disorders that we diagnose in the clinic, like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, how that's different from what we try to study in the lab, which is really the risk of development of disorder and how we can prevent that. So I'm looking at trying to understand if the risk factors associated with bipolar disorder actually change how the cells function. And this is one of the more translational aspects of what we do, trying to see if we can use medications that are already available that are not currently used for bipolar disorder. Can we use those to correct things that we see in the lab? So calcium channel blockers are not used very commonly in psychiatry, but they're used very commonly for high blood pressure. And there are certain ones that cross the blood-brain barrier and might be useful for bipolar disorder, and there are a lot of people actually studying that actively right now. So that's one of the more translational directions that our research goes in. And then the other thing that I do is that I work on genome editing technology. So this would not be used therapeutically, but rather to try to modify the genes in cells to see if we can correct some of the phenotypes that we see in cells. So we're not editing the genomes of whole human beings, but trying to understand if we can really pinpoint what genetic changes are related to risk. And is there something we could do to modify that? Is there a medication we could give that would modify risk so that a person doesn't have as many episodes, or maybe doesn't convert from being at risk to having a full disorder? And we're always expanding our sample size. We're always taking in new people who want to participate, not only people who are living with, but people who don't have mental illness at all, because we need to know, we need to understand resilience. We need to understand how risk affects families. And that was everything. So, yeah, we can turn the lights back on so nobody falls asleep. I know it's post-lunch and getting later in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So,
Tom, do you want to?
No, I questions, comments? Yeah.
Do you have a CRISPR lab that you work in?
yes, actually, I do work. Yes. Yes.
Is it bad calcium and good calcium?
That's an excellent question. So, calcium is something that we require throughout our bodies, right? It's part of our teeth, it's part of our bones. It's very, very important. And what we're actually studying is the way that your body manages calcium, because calcium obviously is very important for a lot of things. But for example, if you have bones that are too dense, that's just as bad as having bones that aren't dense enough. So one can have too much calcium in certain places, too little calcium in other places. And so there isn't really a sense that there is a good or a bad. It more has to do with the amount. And so what we're trying to understand is how are neurons managing that calcium? Because too much calcium in neurons kills them, and we know that. So it may be that for people who have some of these risk factors, some of these genetic risk factors, that their neurons are managing calcium inappropriately. And if there's something we could do to help with that, that may prevent some of the neuronal damage that we see. Yeah. Yes.
Why do you want to look at calcium channel blockers instead of sodium channel blockers or other drugs that are available or that target receptors?
Yeah. So so that everybody can hear it, why would we want to look specifically at calcium channel blockers as opposed to other ion channel blockers? And the answer is that we don't at all. Actually, in bipolar disorder, for example, we have sort of borrowed some of the medications that are used for epilepsy. So epilepsy is treated a lot by sodium channel blockers. And so we often don't use doses that are quite as high as people with epilepsy require. Usually bipolar disorder, we use doses that are a bit lower, but we do use sodium channel blockers, absolutely. What we don't understand is why they help. So in our lab, we're focusing on calcium channel right now because it's been implicated in genome-wide association studies. So we have a very clear link between what's been identified by other geneticists and drugs that are currently available but aren't being used. But it would be very reasonable for us to go back and say, okay, well, if we know that something like Depakote or something like Tegretol is helpful in bipolar disorder, why don't we go and try to figure out what phenotype in bipolar disorder cells that it's changing? The other thing that would be probably of particular interest to you is that there's a postdoc working in Lori Isom's lab in pharmacology, Chad Fraser, who thought that he was studying, and truly is studying, epilepsies that are related to sodium channel mutations. What they found was that they had a drug that they were using in their experiments that they meant to be a sort of control, because it was a calcium channel manipulating drug or a potassium channel manipulating drug. It actually corrected the phenotype they were looking at, which meant that they had to now go figure out, can that drug be used in these certain types of epilepsies that previously had no treatment? So I think that we're always kind of surprised by what science reveals to us, that we thought we were working on one problem, but it turns out that this control that we thought was going to be, the nothing control actually did something, because there was something about the illness that we didn't understand. So we picked calcium channels because that was pickable, and I had to pick a thing, right? There's me and my hands, and that's it. And so that's what I started with. But that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
So I had, my husband and I both had our 23andMe genetics analyzed. And I'm wondering, that was probably about 7 years ago, pre getting married a second time to find out if he has the Alzheimer's treatment.
Yes.
So, but do you recommend that you get retested? Should you be retested? I mean, can your genetic makeup change?
Yeah, so there are does your genetic makeup change? I can say that no, your personal genetic makeup does not change. However, the results that you get from any of those tests may change because the way the test is done may change, or our understanding of how a gene impacts disease will change. So your gene didn't change, but our ability to understand what it does change.
Knowledge is, have they changed the way they test people's?
Yeah, so I don't end up working with a lot of 23andMe data, but I do have some patients who have gotten, what's the name for it? There's GeneSight testing. So GeneSight testing is one that specifically is looking at whether or not a person has genetic variant. So these aren't mutations. It's not like a cancer-causing mutation. It's just a variant that's part of the normal population that would make them more or less likely to have a side effect to an antidepressant, or more or less likely to have a side effect to an antipsychotic. And those have changed over time as we've understood differently about which variants are correlated and which are not. I think that you talking specifically about Alzheimer's disease, for example, our understanding of how ApoE alleles affect Alzheimer's risk does change over time. And probably they're looking at different markers now than they were 10 years ago.
Well, I think that 23andMe people are up on that.
They might well be. Because I don't see their data very often, I don't know how often they update those tests. And the other thing that concerns me a little bit about 23andMe and other sort of how do I say this? They are commercial companies that are doing the genetic screens, is that they don't provide a lot of interpretive information. So, they say they give you a yes/no answer, but what does that yes/no actually mean? Or is there something that you could do to modify the risk that you've been told about? And that I find a little bit troubling, because it's hard for me to keep up with that literature as well. So if somebody comes to me and says, I found out that I have, the risk allele for, I had one patient who came to me with a COMT variant, and he thought that maybe that was why he wasn't responding to antidepressants. That was possible, but it was also possible that there were other things like his sleep apnea that was, making his likelihood to respond to medications lower, and a lot of family strife that was going on. And so I think a lot of those genetic tests can can provide information, but they can be difficult for me to interpret, and they are often quite difficult and scary to interpret if you got them in the isolation of having any counselor or geneticist to talk to about them. Yes.
I'm not sure whether it's fair to ask you this question.
I will be honest if I don't know the answer.
We've been coming to NAMI things for many, many years. Our son is mid-40s. He has schizophrenia. It was diagnosed typical, freshman, end of the freshman year, just about 19. If we look back long enough, there were probably things going on. We happened to see a social worker, but full-blown episode. And he is on Risperdal, has been, refuses to budge for anything else. But what my question really focuses on, we used to hear more about schizophrenia at general meetings and the research that I do see. I know the focus now is on very much on early intervention and
Yes.
prevention, which makes lots of sense. But I haven't heard anything. Well, some of us are still living.
Yes.
We're living with, and we're getting older, and we're living with children
Right.
in our NAMI group too, who are mature adults, intelligent, college graduate, but no jobs, schizophrenia, no changes. Is there anybody doing anything, research, medication, anything about people who already? I know the preventions are important, but we have to live too.
Right.
Is there
Right.
anybody doing research on schizophrenia?
Yes, actually, I think in comparison to bipolar disorder, for example, schizophrenia has been much more widely studied.
Right.
And largely, I think that's due to a number of factors, partially being that bipolar disorder can be difficult to study because the episodes come and go more frequently, whereas schizophrenia tends to stay more consistently. And yes, there has been a lot of focus on early intervention, and that happens to be the trendy thing now. And that's no insult to it. I do it too. I'm involved in early intervention.
I mean, it's not
Yeah.
that we don't want this.
Yeah, but I would say that most of the medication trials that have been done are with people who are, adults who have the illness. Pharmaceutical companies have pulled away from that somewhat because they've had some difficulty getting finding successful medications. And I don't know if Dr. Taylor could speak more thoughtfully to that type of research, because I am more involved in the early intervention than the ongoing studies, but there are many ongoing.
Well, yeah, there's still a great deal of research going on with the people with, we call it chronic schizophrenia. So it's not that that's been abandoned. It's been, a challenge to find, some other medication besides something that does, that hits dopamine. But that's the work that's being done. It is being done in people largely who have ongoing schizophrenia. So it's not just that we're focused only on the early side, but it's still it's a challenge to try to figure out what the targets, as we say, the drug targets are. Dr. Williams is saying that some of the pharmaceuticals, maybe people have already heard this, but they have been pulling out of CNS research. So.
I do know that there are some people working on transcranial magnetic stimulation in psychosis and electroconvulsion. Yeah, so in schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, and those studies are being done with people who are fully symptomatic, not early or high risk. So there are some early and high risk studies as well, but there are other types of neuromodulation studies that are being done as well. Well, yeah. So there's actually.
Schizophrenia, they don't agree to their medication.
Well, and we actually had a grand round speaker who presented something really interesting that I would have assumed would not have gone over very well, and that was using a mobile app to basically have cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis in a phone app that could be accessed when you wanted it to be. And so the app basically monitors where you are and asks you questions like, are you feeling like this, or are you having experiences like this? And at face value, I thought, well, I don't know if a person who's paranoid wants to be followed. But what he found was that actually people were more than happy to have their cell phone to work with because they have their cell phone with them all the time. And it turns out if you tell people, I am monitoring you. Is that okay with you? They get to make a choice, like, yes, I'm okay with that, or no, I'm not. And that's another study that's being done. I think this person was from Dartmouth, trying to understand how to provide sort of on-the-go therapy as it's needed, so that a person has access to that whenever they want it, as opposed to, waiting for their one session a month where they were going to sit with their counselor to talk about these things.
Do you know a name of who's,
I would have to
somebody does?
look his name up, but I'd be happy to do that.
Great.
I don't know if Dr. Taylor remembers this person.
He's doing right now still trials, and he's working in Chicago, and a couple of other places in the country. But there's a number of people doing trials with these mobile apps, and mobile health technology has become very big. So there's a lot of
So let me mention another one. This is Work It is for people who are challenged with substance use problems, and the exhibitor out here today, Lisa McLaughlin, is distributing cards that people with the concern can sign up for, and family members can sign up for. This is a program that is being offered to hospital or healthcare systems and to insurers, and they will use this and offer it to people who they think are at risk. Now, any of us can get on board and try this out, and I recommend that you do so.
There's a free trial offer for up to 100 people.
Yeah.
For individuals or for family members that want to.
This is the mother of Miss Workit, a very strong advocate of NAMI.
It's addiction. No, it's for a whole range of things. It's not schizophrenia. But the amazing thing about the app is that the individuals who have developed it are living with the conditions. Okay. So they have firsthand knowledge of what they've gone through in terms of addiction, bipolar, depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders. I mean, there's a whole range of spectrums that they're doing all these trials, and they're all being monitored. And University of Michigan is connected with it, and Spectrum Health, and different groups. I had a question. So the Pector study is primarily a cellular study, correct?
No, actually, I realize why you might have thought that based on my presentation.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
mostly a clinical research program. So the stem cell part is a very small part of it. We have 1,300 subjects, and the vast majority of people participate in just bi-monthly questionnaires about how they're doing, what medications they're trying, what other things they're doing that are effective or ineffective. Like I said, the stem cell is a very small portion of that. It's mostly a clinical observational study trying to understand how the illness changes over time.
Have there been any studies that have used family members, researched the family members of the individuals, probably best in conjunction with an ongoing study? Because oftentimes family members, and that's why NAMI started, family members have been really cut off from the medical community for multiple reasons. Part of it's just privacy, especially if you have an adult patient. But there's such a wealth of knowledge that these family members are walking around with and would love to share with the medical community, to do with whatever you do in terms of your research. So I just wonder if there's ever been a large study that has included, a pool of family members as well to use as comparison.
Yeah, so actually we do have people in the Proctor study who are family members who have not been diagnosed. Some of them are listed as controls, but over time they may develop depression, and so they would get re-diagnosed and moved into a different category. But we do have family members as well as what we call probans, or the person who initially came in with symptoms. the vast majority of genetic studies, not the genome-wide association studies, but some of the original genetic studies were done, and it's especially true in autism, on triads, so parent, parent, child, to try to understand the genetic variants that may have contributed to the development of autism or bipolar disorder. I think that in particular, what's really helpful about having families involved in molecular studies, at least, is that you can look at who has which risk factors and figure out which person developed illness versus which person didn't. And that may tell you something about resilience. It may tell you something about what prevents an illness from developing. So I'm trying to think what you had another large study, RAISE.
The NIMH did a series of studies on the first episode of Institute of Psychosis, RAISE, and those included very light drug therapies, but highly intense wraparound services with families and support services. Am I right, Dr. Taylor?
Yeah, and another important part that families have played in a lot of this, well, the treatment research is in things like McFarland multifamily groups that involve, really using the family and the person with the illness, bringing them together, studying them, and showing how working together to problem solve, there's a pretty significant benefits for that kind of intervention, which is in family to family is a similar design in terms of involving families. Although it doesn't actually involve the loved one. Is that the family? It's just the families.
One of the questions since I've attended a lot of NIMH presentations and webcasts, webinars, there's this focus on cognitive interventions, really an explosion of cognitive interventions. There's an explosion of information about neural pathways and mapping brain neural pathways. And then there's your area, which is the cell, at the cellular level. And I suppose there's others. How do we bring these to, is there a way to map? I'm interested in translating this to lots of people who hear all these things and have a difficult time saying, well, I hear this and I hear this and I hear this. Can we map these in a way and say that here, this is at one level, here's another level, here's a third level, here's a fourth level, and that at some point they will convene. Right.
Yeah, so that's a really important question to ask, because as researchers, we have to carve out an area of science that is small enough that we can make an impact. And we also have, limitations on our time and money. So we carve out something that is a chunk that we can work on. But it is our responsibility to connect that to all the things that other people are doing. And I think that's something that actually the Proctor longitudinal study is quite strong for, is that it's essentially organized as an umbrella organization where there is the principal investigator, Melvin McInnes, supervises and brings in collaborations from across our institution as well as other institutions in an effort to try to do exactly what you're talking about. So, for the people who participate in this study, they can participate in as much or as little as they would like. So, for some people, they really don't want to have research be a huge part of their lives, so they're willing to answer the questionnaires, but they're not going to come in and give a skin sample and then a urine sample and then a blood sample. And some people sign up for all the things. And every time that you ask them if they want to participate in something, they say yes. And so as part of that larger research program, there are people studying the connections between bipolar disorder and cardiovascular disease, because we know that there's a strong link there. Studying the microbiome, the gut microbiome, all the bacteria that live in your gut that influence how you absorb your nutrients and how you metabolize medications and vitamins and things like that. There's somebody working on that. And then there are folks working on what we call neuropsychology parameters, like your processing speed or your perception of emotions. And the more data that we're able to gather from the same person doing multiple different studies, the more likely we're going to be able to connect what we see in the cell to what we see in day-to-day behavior. With that said, it's a big struggle. It's a really big struggle because I'm not a neuroimaging expert. So if somebody asks me a neuroimaging question, I usually direct them right to Dr. Taylor because that's a thing that he understands far, far better than I do. And I think that part of the reason that there is an Unger Fellowship is exactly to address this problem as well, to sort of help see where those links can be forged, and to make sure that if there are gaps in our understanding, if there are things that we are not studying or that we're not explaining very well, that we hear from people who are stakeholders, who are invested in understanding that, and hold our feet to the fire when we say something that's confusing or doesn't make sense or seems contradictory, right? Science is this sort of we try very hard to be organized, but basically we're fumbling towards truth. That's what we're always trying to be doing. And I think that our efforts will be improved by crosstalk amongst scientists, but also with the people who are the genuine stakeholders in how these things are interpreted and how they go.
We have sort of a problem of balancing the biological with the psychosocial, and this is, of course, enormously important. It's very important that NAMI be involved in that. But the RAISE study was mentioned, and this is at the psychosocial level, and the elements there were 4 elements in that, and one was a modified psychopharmacological intervention. The other 3 were psychosocial interventions, and one had to do with something called individualized resilience training. Another was, it's been mentioned here, psychoeducation for families. And a third was supported employment. And NAMI, as an organization, needs to hold our service providers' feet to the fire, one, to balance all that we're doing pharmacologically with these psychosocial interventions, which, after all, are going to be more important, at least in the short run, because we're very hopeful that our young research scientist here is going to come up with some great breakthroughs, but we're not insisting that you do that tomorrow, and don't expect that, Meanwhile, there are a lot of things that we can do, and as an organization, again, we need to have a balance and to hold our providers accountable for providing some of these services that we know are evidence-based, we know are effective.
And I would also say that it's really important for, like I said, the stakeholders being either the people who are living with, the people living in support of, the people providing health care, to be advocates. So when the RAISE study is published and it says that these very organized psychosocial interventions improve outcomes, that's when we need to go to our legislators, to our, providers and say, I've heard about this study and it seems like most of it's not pills. So are we going to start this? Where would I go to find this? How are we going to get it funded? How are we going to get it paid for? Those things are hard to do. Not everybody wants to champion that in the legislature, but I think that advocacy is really, really important, especially in these sorts of interventions that are not very expensive, but likely to be very helpful and, like you said, be helpful tomorrow, whereas the research may not be.
What would you do if there was a pushback from the pharmaceutical companies and the influence they may have in Washington if that study comes out and says that the majority of it is not pill-related?
Well, the study was published last year, I think, and there really wasn't too much pushback. The study also wasn't saying that medication is not useful, but rather that medication alone is inferior to medication plus these other interventions. The other thing that's kind of interesting about some of the pharmaceutical companies is that many of them are actually looking into trying to go beyond pharmaceutical interventions. So Janssen, as part of Johnson & Johnson, has been working on building networks of providers in places like Germany to try out more intensive psychotherapeutic interventions. There are also a lot of people working on mobile technology trying to figure out if there's a way to sort of modify brain activity, which is behavior is the output of brain activity, can you do that in a way that doesn't have a lot of side effects? So pharmaceutical companies actually have been a little more open-minded about that than I expected them to be. Of course, they are probably hurting from all the money that they spent trying to develop medications that didn't turn out to be all that effective, and they probably had to diversify. I don't know that they did it out of the goodness of their hearts, but they are also diversifying, and so I didn't actually see as much pushback against something like RAISE as I might have anticipated.
Am I wrong, but could this psychosocial aspect of the research have some implications in the area of, I forget the name, but as I understand it, we are born with a certain genetic tendency to possibly get bipolar or whatever, and that our environment, the amount of stress in our environment is a very big aspect of why we might get that disease. So is that psychosocial piece that you're talking about taking into account the stress and thereby reducing the likelihood of the disease?
Yes, I think that that's, it addresses there was the notion years ago about expressed emotion, and the idea was that families are too much involved and sort of over-concerned about their the individual who was ill. And one of the nice things about that was that NAMI pushed back, and we said, well, who the hell wouldn't be overly involved and overly concerned when you see your child at 19 or 20 with enormous promise, and it's just very sad, isn't it? And so some of the psychosocial things were to, one, say, hey, look, stop blaming the families, and two, try to help the families deal with some of this through psychoeducation, and it's very important. Another little piece of research that, there are no sort of wonderful cures here, but remember the long-term studies, Courtney Harding, that people 20 years after state hospital experience, many of them are doing quite well. My own brother, who has had his bouts in the state hospital, is doing quite well. He's only a little more eccentric than I am. So, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So we have to, and not everyone is going to achieve that, but we ought not to give up hope, and we certainly ought not to abandon various kinds of psychosocial interventions.
Oh,
add something to the answer to that question?
absolutely.
I have a son with schizoaffective disorder who is in a program that uses the RAISE model, a very new program, very effective. And part of what they do in the individual resilience training is learn that stress is one of the things that affects how their disease is affecting them and how to handle that. And so it's part of the training in the RAISE program.
Yeah.
RAISE is the research, the place that he goes. There's no program in this area that I know of. He goes to Lansing. It's called the EDGE program, early treatment for mental health. It has to be within the 18 months of the onset of psychosis.
Right.
See, my son is also in the EDGE program. I've not had as much positive. Now he's on his 4th medication, and how many hospitalizations and how many bouts of psychotic events. So I guess everybody's, and then that's what we hear all the time, that everybody's different and everybody's
Well,
has different
my son
experience.
had the same experience until he got on Clozaril. And that's another thing I was wondering if you would address, the underutilization of Clozaril.
Yeah.
Because it's challenging. Clozaril is the one where you have to have blood tests every week for a long time.
Yeah.
And so psychiatrists are reluctant to use it, patients are reluctant to use it. It's been around, the pharmaceuticals probably don't want to use it because it's super cheap, because it's been around forever, but it is one of the more effective drugs if you can get people to use it.
It absolutely
I think you
is.
said it right there. It's difficult to use. It requires a slow titration. A lot of sedation is a big problem, big side effect. And the blood draws are daunting, but the blood draws have been very effective at almost eliminating the blood problems associated with it. So, but they still require weekly blood draws, and not everyone likes to get a needle stuck in their arm every week.
Well, and it's more
The
widely.
difference with the Clozaril is that it works on a lot of the symptoms, the lack of motivation, all the things that you can't treat with most medications. So
And it is a
Agreed to it readily.
it took a long time.
Okay, so
Hospitalizations before he agreed to it.
oh, okay, there we
Yeah.
go. That sounds like
And a lot of medications.
And I would say that there are places in the world where they are less, there's not as much testing in Europe or China, and that means that Clozaril is more widely used there because it is not so burdensome for the providers or the family. I don't know that I am convinced that one method of testing or another method of testing is more or less safe, but I would say that clearly, in countries where their regulatory system is different, that affects how medications are prescribed and it affects how comfortable people are trying something. Absolutely. The other thing, I wanted to address something that you had asked about stress. And whether or not, how the environment affects our experience of our risk, right? So all the genetic variants that I study are part of the normal population. So having a certain risk factor is not your destiny. Your genes are not your destiny in these situations. And we do know that environment affects how genes are expressed. So that might be one way in which these types of psychosocial interventions really are having an effect on how your brain is functioning. I mean, therapy does change how your brain works for the better. And that's something that some of the medications do as well. It may be part of the reason that therapy effects tend to be more long-lasting is that they are learned over time rather than something that's just given on a one-time basis. But it's absolutely true that the environment changes how your genes are expressed, how your body functions, and so it makes sense that these interventions are effective in that way. I think you and then you, sorry.
Is there anyone, or knowing that we have a son who is resistant to change, he knows he is surviving on Risperdal, his psychiatrist has recommended Clozaril, and he gave him literature, et cetera, and he looks it over and says, that's interesting, goodbye. Is there anybody that's really good or effective that someone their stand? Or is that just one of the things we have to look
It is one of the things, unfortunately, that it's, you can bring a person to the medication, but,
Yeah.
we.
I mean, at least we're past where he refuses medication.
Yeah.
He takes
Yeah.
medication.
Yeah.
Well,
That's years.
I will say from my experience at the national convention, the national NAMI convention, was that it really seemed like the experience of most of the people there was that the involvement of their family and loved ones in having conversations with them about why they think a treatment change might be indicated was far more effective than having the psychiatrist or the nurse practitioner do the explaining. So psychoeducation is really important. It's a necessary part. The person who's prescribing has to explain their rationale, but they are nowhere near as effective in getting that type of buy-in as family members and loved ones. And so I tell people, if that's really something that you feel powerfully about, powerfully tell them that regularly, like they need to hear from you that it matters to you, and they need to hear it consistently, even when we're talking about something that is really emotionally important, it has to be repeated a couple times before somebody really gets it, that it's very emotionally important to you. And I would say that if you feel that there is improvement to be gained by changing something, like changing a housing situation or changing a therapist or something like that, the families and the loved ones who are close to that person are the ones who are going to be the most effective at communicating why that is and helping get some buy-in about why a change might be worth the risk.
I'd like to, we're talking about as if we're talking to a person who has a person involved. NAMI recently produced a monograph called On Engagement, which approaches this issue of engagement at a system level, not at an individual level. I mean, it's sometimes we don't have the kind of relationship that can make a difference, but it's important systems to understand that it is really their function to form engagements with people. So you can get this report from NAMI.org/engagement. And it is to be used in an advocacy way to say that part of the therapeutic community, the focus of the therapeutic community should be on engagement. And now, does this sound surprising? No. It sounds like, well, why aren't they doing this normally? And I think it can be a threat to existing providers and trainers of professionals that NAMI should be telling them that they need to be more engaging. But in fact, we all know that is exactly what needs to be done. And I urge you, one of the questions in the report was, and it really had to do with very hard to serve people, quote unquote hard to serve, who so frequently don't want your help. Go away, I don't want your help. And what we have to do is find ways of working with people who don't want our help. And the question in the engagement survey had to do with enrollment into a program, and said, do you trust me? Do I have a good enough relationship with you as a consumer, potential consumer, for you to fill out 10 pages of an input questionnaire so that they'll become part of the service? So really it puts the burden on the service providers to form the engaged relationships. Tom's dying to say something.
Yeah, I'm dying to say something. So this is another plug for family to family, eh? Because these are the issues that come up in that, and you have 10 or 12 weeks to, try to deal with that. And peer-to-peer, if you can encourage your family member to become involved. And then, here's the punchline. Why don't we work harder to get Dr. Taylor and Dr. Williams to emphatically refer people to NAMI, family to family, and peer-to-peer? And why do those people at the Depression Center somehow think that everything is sort of bounded by the walls there, and that there aren't important resources outside of that? And that's why we're so delighted, of course, that Dr. Taylor is sponsoring Dr. Williams, and that we have this kind of connection, because this is what the future is all about, and we want to be part of it.
I would also say that as somebody who, only finished residency a couple of years ago, it can be difficult to know what all is available in the community, right? So I know what's available at the Depression Center because that's where I got lectures for 5 years. So I know exactly what they have. But if you as a family member or you as a client, have information or have questions, bring them into your providers, because we are always wanting to know what's available, because even something that might not have been all that appealing to you might appeal a lot to somebody else. And all of that information exchange is really important. And again, that's, I think, part of my job is to try to both gather that information and disseminate it as somebody who provides.
So if you were in substance use services, you would be required to go to an AA meeting and to other 12-step meetings. You'd be required to know what is outside. Presently, all the mental health providers, including the social workers, whom I'm most responsible for, don't do enough of this, and they don't know what is outside. But Barbara Ness she wants to say something. So
to make another plug in terms of engagement, it is hard often as a family member to get someone engaged. Often there are children we've raised and we have a certain way to talk of them, but I'd like to plug the book by Xavier Amador, I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. And while it might not always work, it talks about what to do when it doesn't work, and it's a way of engaging people that's respectful, that you're an adult person making your own decisions, how are things going, is that working, here's what I think, you don't need to agree with me, but in a very, very respectful way, and I found that immensely helpful. It's a book called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, and the author, the last name is Amador, A-M-A-D-O-R.
It's also the LEAP model.
The LEAP model.
Mm-hmm.
It's
He's on,
Yeah.
by the way, just go to the internet. There's a
Yeah.
treasure trove of his presentations on what do you call it? YouTube.
And
You
they're.
can get Amador till you're green.
It ju-
It's really, he's spoken at NAMI conferences.
Yeah,
Very-
yes.
Right, he's very good.
Very knowledgeable.
Just a word about other providers that we said something about tell your psychiatrist or bring a psychiatrist. Sometimes more minds are better, than one, and so maybe we need, as an NAMI group, need to make better use of nurse practitioners and PharmDs, people who maybe come at it a different angle and don't maybe have the taint of a particular psychiatrist. I mean, any particular provider, social worker, whatever, can acquire a taint over time with certain people, and so give them different people to interact with if possible.
It takes a community.
It really does, and I think we talk about this a lot on the bipolar disorder team, because on the bipolar disorder team we have trainees at all levels: nurse practitioners, social workers, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and so there are oftentimes situations where whatever individual training the one primary provider has is just not sufficient. It's just, we don't have the skill set that we need to address a new problem, or we've tried the skill set that we thought was going to help and it's just not cutting it. And so we are really open about just saying, like, I tried these things, it isn't working, who has other ideas? And that's one of the advantages of, I think, having this sort of like cross-dimensional approach, and that's something that NAMI can certainly advocate for as well.
I just wanted to know your opinion about the relationship between methylation process and then the bipolar or any mental health issue.
Sure. So the question is about methylation on DNA, which is part of how the environment controls gene expression. So when genes have tags added to them, they're added by certain cellular processes. Those tags either make the gene more likely to be expressed or less likely to be expressed. And so there hasn't been a huge amount of research about this in bipolar disorder, but there have been some studies looking at whether or not there are global hyper or hypomethylation changes. And it doesn't seem like there is any massive global change, but rather there are individual genes that are more likely to be expressed or less expressed. And those are all very small studies at this point. So people are actively trying to replicate that and see if any of those hold true over larger populations. But it's epigenetics, so that the field is called epigenetics. So genetics is looking at the genes, just the sequence, and epigenetics is the things around the genes. And epigenetics is relatively new in psychiatry. There's more work being done, for example, in schizophrenia, just because sample sets are just larger, not because schizophrenia is more or less interesting, but rather that there were more people who were studying it, and so it was easier to get the DNA for that. And it does look like there are some massive gene expression changes there where it seems to be predominantly lower expression of various types of genes. So the pattern for schizophrenia seems to be different than the pattern for bipolar disorder, but again, all those studies are rather small.
Go ahead.
I have a question. It's a two-part question. First is, how can you induce like an unhealthy environment, like maybe social stress, in cells in a petri dish? So I'm thinking of like cortisol.
Yep.
And then the other thing is, then how can we put medications to change and reverse these epigenetics effects, and maybe even the combination of medications, because people have to constantly change in order for it to be effective.
Right. So those are all excellent questions that we grapple with all the time. That's why I'm so she works in a lab next door to mine. And we're very excited to have young, fresh perspectives on what types of questions we could be asking. So it is very difficult to try to model stress in a culture dish. It's easier with animal models because you can, mice are social creatures. So if you want to stress them, you can house them in isolation, and that stresses them, very much like humans, for example. With cells, they don't seem to mind if they are in isolation or not. But something like adding cortisol. So cortisol is a hormone that increases in all of us when we wake up in the morning, but it also increases during times of stress. So that's a model that some people are working on using. It's a little difficult to know exactly what to add because we don't know in the brain whether or not cortisol levels at individual synapses are changing or not. We only know that cortisol levels in the blood are changing. So there are actually some people working on trying to understand whether or not the hormone differences or the signaling differences that we find in the blood of people who are stressed and acutely, having a manic episode, for example, whether or not those same changes are happening in the brain. And then it would be a little more valid for us to go back and say, yes, we should add that to the culture dish and see what happens. I believe that there are people working on modulating DNA methylation, like using medications not medications, but compounds, like drug compounds, to see if that alters methylation patterns. I don't know how far that has gotten in terms of determining whether or not that would, increase or decrease cancer risk or something like that. So as it's not my area, I don't know. But I am aware that there are people trying to study whether or not those types of modifications might help for correcting some of the gene expression changes that you see.
We're getting near to the end, so I want us to kind of focus in the last few minutes on what should we do? What can we individually do next? I have a couple of suggestions. There's a very interesting video that was just produced by Detroit Public Television called Ride the Tiger, which Dr. Williams is in, and a number of other luminaries. I don't know if you're in it, are you, Steve? No, you didn't make the cut.
Specifically about bipolar.
But it's one of those translational videos, documentaries, that does go across the range of research. And it's very interesting to see that and to say this is exactly the kind of representations we need to learn and get excited about. The second thing I would suggest, oh my gosh, what happens when your brain goes blank? Oh, yes. It's really important. Clinical trials are really important. And I want to urge you to consider becoming part of a clinical trial if you're not already part of one. You can learn about them from the NIMH website. Just Google clinical trials, NIMH, and you can... National Institute of Mental Health. And you should learn about them, and I suppose you could call and say I want to be put on your mailing list, even if I don't qualify. I'd like to learn more about. So I think that's one way of learning about it, and it's one way of participating in it. And NIMH Outreach Partnership Program really says part of our job as NAMI in this state is to suggest that people become more engaged in clinical trials. And I turn it over to you. What would you suggest people do? What's next to become more informed?
Would you like to go first?
I would like to hear from you folks. We've had a day of this now. What are we sort of energized to do tomorrow, next week, and next month?
How do you get medical students to go on the second?
This is so basically what I do is I talk to anybody who has any interest in talking to me. If an undergraduate, graduate student, high school student reaches out to me and says, I want to talk to you, I'm interested in neuroscience, I'm interested in the brain, I always make time for it, all the time. Because I think that one of the most important things that I can do is to encourage people to do the tough thing. Medical school is hard, graduate school is hard, but it's doable, and people need for people to be engaged in these studies. So that's one of the things that I personally always do. And so if you have anybody in your life that you think would want to talk to somebody about this career path, send them my way. I think the other thing really has to do with doing everything that you can to fight stigma, because stigma exists in medical school as well. So there were definitely times where people laughed about the fact that I was going into psychiatry because that certainly was a good lifestyle. You know, it certainly wasn't as hard as surgery, for example. You know, I have my opinions about that, but you know, it is there is this idea that somehow psychiatry is different from medicine, and that mental health conditions are different from physical health conditions, and it's simply untrue. I mean, there's no basis for that in fact at all. Yes, stress makes depression worse. It also makes diabetes worse. It also makes blood pressure worse. So, you know, the brain is a part of the body, and we have to treat it as such. And I think that as advocates, as just everyday people, you know, if you hear somebody making a joke about how a mental health condition isn't such a big deal, that's your opportunity to say, oh, it's interesting you would say that. I wonder what makes you say something like that, because it now turns it into a conversation instead of, you know, a one-off joke that we're all kind of hoping nobody really took very seriously. I think that stigma has to be fought at multiple levels in order to get people in medical school, for example, or social work to want to commit their lives to that, because otherwise it does seem scary somehow, or it seems foreign somehow, and it isn't. But it's a daily process. Fighting stigma is a daily process. But I do think that's important for medical school.
And I think it's up to us. It's not just stigma. It's huge ignorance on the part
Yes.
of the broad population as to how much mental illness there is and how much it's affecting our world. My game just got more complicated. I've been with NAMI for like 15 years, and the family was here in Michigan, and now they're in LA, and they're in Fort Lauderdale, they're in Topeka, different states, different laws, different worlds. And how do I help my kids' family? Keeping myself educated and available to them, but I'm not there to take them out to dinner and talk about their problems. And you know, but I think we can all be of help by keeping informed and keeping, like I said, when somebody says something that just is off the wall, it's like, wait a minute.
Take them all to a national conference.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that in terms of distance, I think that young people have really started doing this a lot more, and I'm seeing more people like my elderly aunts and uncles really getting to using FaceTime and Skype. Those types of like video conversations with people who live far away from you are huge in feeling like they're not isolated. You know, like, yes, they may be physically far away from you, but you're in their face. They can see your reactions. They can see your voice reflected in your face. And that's huge for fighting isolation as well.
I was in NAMI conference, national conference, and Dr. Insel, who was the director at the time of NIMH, who's now gone over to Google to work on apps, I believe. A person in the NAMI audience said, our doctors are 15 years behind the times. They don't know the research. You know, Insel was talking about the latest research. How do we address that? And it was very instructive. He said, you know, you have to become citizen scientists. And get the article, download the article. It may cost you $10 underline it, highlight it, take it into your doctor and say, I just read this, I want you to read it, and I want to talk to you about it later. Now, that may not work with all doctors. But I thought that was a remarkable suggestion for the director of the National Institute of Mental Health to say that really we have to be willing to read the articles. They're written in English, you know, at least the first few pages are. So become informed and become an advocate. And really, it is talking about advocacy. And now we really do have to stop, I think, 3:30. But I want to remind you, and I'll give it to you, Tom, I'm not going to, but that Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. at Miller Manor is the opportunity for us to talk to via NAMI and 5 other organizations who are co-sponsors, advocacy organizations in our county, to talk to the Department of Health and Health Services about the changes in Medicaid mental health And it's very important. This is a chance you can take to be an advocate for NAMI.
So, thanks very much to Dr. Williams. It was a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for coming. The door is now locked, but it will be opened as soon as you complete your evaluation. So, please do that. We'll take that into account next time we have such a presentation.